Hello, this is Chris Gray, your host, with our new talk show, The Captain's Table. Back in the 1800s, when ships would sail on long voyages, the captain of the ship would invite the passengers he considered to be the most interesting to sit at his table, which was elevated in the dining hall, and he would talk to them while the other passengers listened to the conversation. This was one of the original radio or podcast shows. We are trying to bring that tradition back with our show where we will have some great conversations and some interesting guests. Today, we are fortunate to have as our guest Rick Tuttle. Hi, Rick.
Hi, Chris.
Let me tell you a few things about Rick. Rick, who in the summer of 1963 was a volunteer with the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee in Mississippi and in Georgia. He worked on the No on Prop 14, which is the Rutherford Housing Act campaign in California. He worked with Californians for Liberal Representation and the California Federation of Young Democrats. He worked on the Robert Kennedy 1968 campaign and later was elected to the LA Community College Board and as LA City Controller. Welcome to the show. And Rick, can you tell me how you got started in your activism and your political work?
Well, Chris, it's glad to be part of Captain's Table, and all due regard to Tom Kaptain and to you. It's a pleasure to, in a figurative sense, spend some time at the table with you and your other guests who are listening. So in terms of my activism, I suppose that I come from parents who are civically engaged in various ways. My mother and her mom in Arkansas were good friends and neighbors of the first woman ever elected to the United States Senate, which, by the way, is one of the great trivia questions to ask. Who's the first woman ever elected to the United States Senate?
You stumped me.
And surprising how few people know her name. Her name was Hattie Caraway, Senator Hattie Caraway, and from Jonesboro, Arkansas. And her husband, Thaddeus Caraway, died in office. He was appointed by the governor of Arkansas, who never got a commitment from her that she wouldn't run because he himself was interested. And she did run and was elected in 1932 in a campaign well known because Huey Long came into Arkansas to help her and saw in her in the context of those times, a very progressive Democrat. She then was reelected in 1938, beating John McClellan, who later served in the Senate. It was defeated by Bill Fulbright. My father, active in civic affairs, was, among other things, a member of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, NAACP, in Connecticut. And both folks always civically engaged. So by the time I came along, they were not directly in politics. I suppose my baptism personally was as a member of the Alpha Chi Rho fraternity in Connecticut at Wesleyan University, where, along with a number of other friends, some of your listeners may know the name of Bruce Corwin of blessed memory, or Steve Trott, the members of this house. We were the fraternity that had the highwaymen. And again, people of a certain age may remember they had number 1, number 3, and 5 on the hit parade. Michael, row the boat ashore, being one of them. I'll spare you my rendition of the lyrics.
I remember this. I remember the song is very famous.
They had 3 of the top 10. They hit the jackpot. They had Michael. They had Gypsy Rover, went over the hill, and also Cotton Fields. And 4 of the 5 got out of the business, went on to professional school. Steve became Associate Attorney General, the Reagan administration, with number 2 deputy DA out here earlier, and wound up being a Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals federal judge. And Bruce, of course, Corwin, tremendous, both are dear friends. Bruce and I were roommates, and Steve and I were actually the fraternity. And they played, and Bruce became chairman of Tom Bradley's campaigns and/or finance chairman of their campaigns. Any campaign I had, and a dear friend of some of our mutual friends, Howard Berman, and Henry Waxman, and so on. Anyway, the battle was over discrimination in the fraternity. And Steve and Bruce had become the test case for this. And upon their willingness to take the position that they would not join unless we got rid of the clause, they knew what they'd been briefed on, on exactly what to say. We basically fired our national after a year of trying to get them to comply, and became a fraternity called EQV, esse quam videre in Latin, to be rather than to seem to be. In other words, the racially discriminatory clause was the hidden clause. The religious clause was right out in the open, however. In any event, white Christians only. And we battled that. And as I reflect back on it, it didn't take a lot of courage to be for civil rights in the middle of the Connecticut River Valley at a liberal arts college. But we were something of the beginning of a breakaway, looking back at it, of what was the silent generation. A lot of people talked about it. The conformity generation, the people who had been silenced either for one reason or another, and part of the reason being McCarthyism and its offshoots. But that was something we lived. It was important to us, at the time, and I suppose the crucial thing, the case of me, I learned something about the vocabulary of civil rights. Also, I was appointed. Jay Levy, who was also in our fraternity, who's just retired, one of the leading age researchers out of San Francisco. He's in our house. He got me on the Human Relations Committee of the college, and again, that furthered my interest. So that was step one, and step two. Go ahead, Chris.
Oh no, I was just going to follow up saying that seems, both from your parents' side and from your initiation with civil rights issues in college, that led to you going to the South. So I'd love to transition to how you did that and what some of the memories were of the civil rights movement in the early 60s.
Well, there are some things that stick in, I guess, any of our memories when, depending on the circumstances, and you get into a situation like that, the memories, it's all pretty vivid. What happened in my case is, again, it's a Wesleyan story. Don Walls, who came out here in California and made a career as a great public school teacher at Palisades High School, and as I understand it, taught the decathlon team that did very well, an academic decathlon team, and so on. Don and I were rooming together, and he shared these views that I was just describing. A room together at the fraternity as well, and we had wanted to join the Freedom Ride when we learned of it, and learned that two Wesleyan professors, John McGuire, who later wound up out here as president of the Claremont Graduate Schools here in California, and David Swift, who was chairman of the religion department, and they joined William Sloane Coffin, who, as you may know, is immortalized in Gary Trudeau's Doonesbury as the Reverend Scott Sloane.
Okay.
Well, we knew of Dr. Coffin, Reverend Coffin, because he had been the chaplain at Williams, where he had fought the fraternity discrimination issue up there. And just before he left to be chaplain at Yale, in apparently just a drunken bad joke, some of the fraternity guys who didn't like his views on anti-discrimination matter burned a KKK-style cross on the door of his home near the Williams campus. He was well known and in our circles respected. And he inspired McGuire and Dr. McGuire and Dr. Swift to join him on the Freedom Rides. It was a big deal because every school child has seen pictures of the burning of the bus in Anniston. And the genius of the Freedom Ride is that it was clearly interstate. It trumped any states' rights issue. And clearly understand it brought out the ugliness of the enforcement mobs and police holding their arms and stepping back, enforcement of segregation. That's where John Lewis was so badly beaten and others. And so for these chaps to go struck us as admirable and courageous to go on the next bus with a pretty good idea of what was coming. Anyway, they did get home safely. We were inspired by it, but we missed the chance to go. In other words, they had already pulled out by the time we got into it. And I remember saying to myself, contemporary matter, miss this time and would do it. Maybe I can get involved in that way some other time. After all, America has racial issues, the racial problems to this moment. And the battle on segregation was against segregation and in its various forms. Officially sanctioned segregation was if not the beginning, an early part of an ongoing battle in the mid-20th century. I came out to California for graduate school at UCLA at Bruce's suggestion. In fact, a lot of us came out here partly because of the partly due to the magnetism, in my case, almost directly due to the magnetism of Bruce Corwin. I came out, and later others came, but I was here. And in the middle spring of '63, I read an article by John Poppy in Look magazine regarding courageous Sam Block, Charles McLaurin, and Willie Peacock, and Bob Moses, others registering voters in the Mississippi Delta, which they were under heavy siege. Their lives were threatened. People would not give them housing for a long time. They were sleeping in cars, finally got an office, and had mounted this registration drive. I looked into it and determined that I would consider going down in the summer. I was single. I was not in debt. I had a teaching assistantship lined up for the next fall and a resident advisor position also. And if I'm ever going to, I said to myself, if I'm ever going to get involved in this, this is the time. I don't have family obligations, so on and so forth. In any event, that idea was just below the surface, and then Birmingham fire hoses and what happened in the Birmingham, Bull Connor, Dr. King, and the children being smashed, their bodies being smashed by the velocity of the fire hoses. I determined at that point it's time to make it happen, and so I determined to go down to registration. When I called my folks, my mother and dad got the call. I wasn't asking permission. I was 23 at the time. I wasn't asking their permission. I was telling them what I was going to do, and they were acting the way I would react these days as a grandparent or would have as a parent. But I remember my mother most memorably said, "Now, Rick," she said, "I'm from Arkansas." She said, "Not Mississippi. Don't go to Mississippi." And but I went anyway. And let me pause for a minute and see if you want to ask me anything else about all this before we get down to the experience itself.
No, I understand where you're coming from, and no, please proceed and let me know how you got to Mississippi and why.
I'll continue. So in any event, as it turned out, I had become acquainted. I played a role. Bob Patricelli, who was our student body president at Wesleyan, had made a campaign issue or developed an issue on the bringing of the National Student Association to Wesleyan. And it basically, I think his phrase was something to the effect of, let's get Wesleyan politics out of the sandbox into the real world. And Steve Trott and I were asked by him to go to an NSA conference up in Springfield or Worcester, Mass. I forget which. Well, we met some remarkable people like Curtis Gans and Barbara Boggs, who were very active in NSA. And we came back and made that record. Bob wins the election. The National Student Association comes to the campus, I come out to at Wesleyan. I come out to UCLA and meet the NSA people on the campus, one of whom, Steve McNichols, had been a freedom rider in 1961, badly beaten. He and I became friendly. He brought a remarkable group of speakers to the campus and knew about what was going on, which was very respected in civil rights circles, both in the South and on the West Coast. And when I mentioned it to him, he said, "Oh, Sam Block, whom I mentioned 5 or 6 minutes ago in our discussion here at the captain's table, is in town, and so is Charles McLaurin. They're going to be at the Religious Conference Center, which is just across the street from the UCLA campus." I knew that. And why don't we connect with them? They're on a fundraising tour, and you can ride to Mississippi with them. There's a gender issue in this, if I may be permitted, Chris, to bring it up.
Absolutely.
And so when I walked up to McNichols, which is in the Kirchhoff Hall at UCLA, where later I made part of my career as an associate dean of student activities. But I walked up to him at Kirchhoff Hall, what was in the place where you pick up your mail. I said to him, "Steve, I'm thinking of going to Mississippi," which I was thinking about it. And Steve said, "Oh, good." At that moment, a young lady walked in. Her first name is Ellen. I'll spare her me mentioning her last name. It's someone I was very, very interested in socially and romantically. She comes along, but adorable. She very progressive. She comes walking in, and McNichols turns from me and says, "Oh, Ellen." He knew Ellen very well. He said, "Oh, Ellen." He said, "Rick is going to Mississippi." And I thought to myself, no more of this thinking about going to Mississippi, Rick. You are going to Mississippi. Absolutely. No paralysis of analysis in this situation. So anyway, and then McNichols arranged for me to meet with them, and and it was on that occasion. They were on their way to after the. I was a little. I think I'm blending 2 evenings, but went from an event at the Religious Conference Center, which was I think early evening event, to a fundraiser being put on by Californians for Liberal Representation (CLR), which was a leading progressive political group in town. It was on the liberal wing of the liberal California Democratic Council, but also an independent operation. And at that event, they were taking a victory lap because they had been the major contributors to Congressman George E. Brown Jr.'s campaign for Congress, had significantly helped Tom Bradley in his first successful race for city council. It helped the Congressman Ed Roybal and Gus Hawkins. I walked in, and the idea was that McNichols and a man named Paul Albert, who was a dear friend became a dear friend of mine and Steve's. And Steve said, "You must meet Paul Albert." Paul had the idea of giving me a letter from Congressman George Brown saying I was a volunteer, asked by him to go to Mississippi or to go to the South to observe voter registration procedures. It would make it clear I was not his staff as such. I was a volunteer observer. But the thinking was not that it would do me any official good, but if I were cornered by roughnecks, Klan people, things like that, it might keep me alive. They might beat me up, but it might not want to murder me if they thought I was federal. So, so I met them, but I didn't know at the time George Brown and Tom Bradley were standing next to each other along with Maury Weiner. That was how Maury Weiner's name was pronounced in those days. And what I did not know at the time later learned that George Brown and Tom Bradley at UCLA had roomed together at the co-op, and were very, very dear friends. And Bradley, about 15 years later, when I was in office, they had a surprise fundraiser for me that Craig Ehrlich, who was a friend of mine, the student body president at UCLA, unbeknownst to me, organized. And the first thing out of Bradley's mouth, this is 1978, which was literally 15 years later, talking about when he first met me and when he heard from me that I was going to Mississippi. He said, "That damn fool going to Mississippi." And he said it with enormous fondness.
That's great.
Anyway, off we go, and we stay overnight somewhere. Sam and Block and Charles McLaurin, and we drive to Mississippi, and I arrive, and I realized I knew this from the Look magazine article, the John Poppy's piece, but also from we spent a good many hours together. These were remarkable men, about my age, and we arrive, and I walk into 708 Avenue N in Greenwood, Mississippi. That's the heart of the Delta. It's where the Delta Planters Organization is. Visited 708 Avenue N 14 years ago. And the building's no longer there, but the foundation is. And so is the stoop in front of it, cement stoop. There were more discussions held out there on that front yard of the stoop. That location was where not only SNCC, but NAACP, CORE, Congress of Racial Equality, Southern Christian Leadership Conference, where it was under the umbrella of Council of Confederated Organizations, COFO. And it had been Medgar Evers' idea, who, as you may know, was head of the NAACP in Mississippi and was a national figure, a great hero in the civil rights movement. America had become acquainted with Mr. Evers because 8 years earlier had been the murder of Emmett Till, and the voice of the African American community in Mississippi was Medgar Evers, who was head of the NAACP at that point. He had said to the various civil rights folks, "Look, you can all squabble in New York and out in Washington, even here in Jackson, over who gets credit for this or that activity and fundraising and press coverage. But it's too dangerous in the Delta for us to be working separately. Let's get under an umbrella in the Delta up in Greenwood." And everyone agreed. And so it was a remarkable group. And they had a sort of a safe house that may have probably had more than one, but one where I stayed. And I can remember, going. This is now in late May and early into early and then mid June, and going down to 1963. Probably the best way to think of it in terms of those who have some sense of world history, 20th century, it's a little bit probably like being in Italy in Mussolini's fascist Italy or Nazi Germany and being in the opposition. There was no law enforcement support within sight. I noticed a piece in the local paper. I happened to see the paper that the local FBI agent was running for the state legislature. That means he's running in a lily white primary. I remember going to for example, a church situation where on a Sunday night, it wasn't a religious service, a voter registration rally. People gathered, and my main assignment was to say a few words, and which I would do, and basically be a kind of witness the fact that you have allies in the North and the West, and we're there for you, which I literally was. And one of the more uplifting experiences also is to be with some of these remarkable people. And what I think the main thing we had was song. The songs were uplifting, and we all know "We Shall Overcome," but there are also a variety of other songs, and the lyrics just could be adapted. I will spare you it. I'll spare you here at this Kaptain's table, me a cappella singing them, unless you really insist, and I'll be happy to. And then I remember going to a rally, voter registration rally outside of Canton, north of Canton. It's a drive. Canton is south of Greenwood on the way to Jackson, basically. But in any event, it was a baseball field. And we're over on the third base side, standing on the third base line from third base to home plate, speaking, a little closer to the stands than that, but on that side, speaking to a pretty good sized crowd of African Americans at this voter registration outdoor rally late on a afternoon, and Sam Block is speaking, and Heacock, a couple others are there, and the crowd is attentive. And then I hear Block say quietly and saying it though to all of us who are time to go. And without further ado, I simply followed their lead. We started walking up towards left field, the left field corner where our cars were parked. The crowd, I glanced off to my left, the crowd simply evaporated into the dusk of the early evening. I glanced over my shoulder to my right, and I could see coming around the right field side of the field cars filled with people in them, with Confederate flags flying from the radio antennas, and it was time to go. We got into the cars and drove matter-of-factly up to the highway, sort of got around out of sight, turned off the lights, and raced through the darkness for a while, made a couple of turns, and then turned the lights back on.
Wow.
And
sounds like
for
a
me,
close
it
call.
was a singular. Yeah, for me, it was a singular experience. I had very much the sense I was with people who'd been through this before, one way or another. They certainly had. I'd read about it earlier, and in fact, I hadn't thought about this until just this moment. We didn't even discuss it. We just went back to the office and went on about the next activity. So that gives you some idea of the context we were in. There between all the bottom line was that in addition to the literacy tests, in addition to which were notoriously unfairly administered towards African Americans, how many grains of sand are there in this bottle? Recite verbatim paragraph 4 of the Mississippi State Constitution, things like that. But in any event,
Rick, just so the viewers understand, and from my own knowledge, because I don't know of other states, but in California today, we don't have a literacy test to register to vote. What's the theory behind it, and who administered it, and how were they able to use a different test on person according to their race?
Oh, those great questions. Let me go backwards. The tests were administered by your county clerk. It was up to her discretion or his discretion as to how each person would be tested. So and they could ask the questions they wish to ask, and and people, everyone understood that was the nature of it. You had in the state of Mississippi, which had hundreds of thousands of voters. I now have forgotten the exact number, but with potential people of voting age, we had a voting age population of, let's say, approximately 1 million people. It may have been 900,000. Only 25,000 were registered to vote. There were some African Americans registered to vote, but in the case of the Caucasian community, the Anglo community, there were vastly, hundreds of thousands were registered to vote in Mississippi. So the reason the states could do it is because they were permitted to do it by state law, and they passed these laws, which included literacy tests. Underlying this was in a good many locales, if you are African American and were dependent upon white bosses in order to work, you'd be fired. And also, as this registration campaign built up in Mississippi, the one I'm describing right now, the efforts that Sam Block and Willie Peacock and Charles McLaurin were making, and as more and more blacks attempted to went down to their courthouses and attempted to register and so on and so forth, and often going in groups, of course, and then lining up. If you attempted to do so, they were cutting African Americans off the welfare rolls. They say there's a term they use, namely, "you're on the county" is the term, meaning you're on county welfare.
Right.
And so in places like Sunflower County, Tallahatchie County, that's where LeFlore County, where Greenwood was, all through the Delta, you would have your name posted, and also the county authorities knew perfectly well then, because they're all county officials, the county clerk, the county welfare people, and so on and so forth. And the countermeasure, which developed out here, was Food for Freedom, where some of the same people I was just describing earlier, Tom Bradley, Maury Weiner, Paul Albert, Steve McNichols, these people, and countless others in the Democratic clubs and the Young Democrats, in just the synagogues, churches, others, would organize food. It was called Food for Freedom, and load up the Teamsters, God bless them. And we're talking Jimmy Hoffa's Teamsters. And we're talking out here, the head of the Teamsters was, I'll think of his name in a minute, or at least I think I will. They jumped in on this and would load these trucks with goods that were, not perishable, canned goods and things like that. And then, or goods that would take a long time to be perishable, and rush them into the Delta, drive across basically the same road that I had driven with Charles McLaurin and Willie Peacock, and Sam Block, and would load them up, in Cheviot Hills, Beverly Hills, West Adams, Baldwin Hills, South LA, Pacoima, Van Nuys, UCLA campus, etc. Load them up, and it wasn't obviously welfare, but it had political content, and which is a pushback against these folks being cut off the rolls because they're trying to register to vote. Any of it, and cut off off welfare by the authorities, and so the Teamsters, apparently, to say I would hear this, these civil rights people may be nonviolent, but we're not. And they would, and as it was described to me on one occasion, I think by Paul Albert, they just put these trucks. These guys were professional drivers, trucks. They would basically drive, bumper to bumper at top speed to go roaring across the southern track into, crossing over Texas into coming in through. I think they came in through Arkansas over to Greenville and then down, made a right turn and went down into Greenwood. So I remember one day, one of the more moving experiences of my life was I knew about this I knew it was happening, aware of it, begun to become aware of it before I went to Mississippi. I was aware of your Food for Freedom. You hear about it in campus circles, and I was had lodging in Cheviot Hills with the wonderful Ruskin family. And it's a whole other interesting story of a battle against anti-Semitism. That's another story. But in any event, the aware of it, and of course, along with it would go some fundraising, some cash to support the effort, all the rest of it. But what was moving is one day I remember it was a early summer. I beg your pardon. A late morning in June, early mid-June, and then around. I'm over by Greenwood. I'm over by a church, and around the corner come these trucks I've just been talking about, one after another, pulling up in front of the church, going into the yard, food, cans, all being unloaded there to support that phase of the civil rights movement. Everyone knew the numbers. If African Americans got registered in Tallahatchie County, it was 65% African American. Or LaFleur County, it was 55% African American. Or Sunflower County, where Senator Eastman's residence was, that was 70% African American. Then you begin to elect sheriffs who are African American, police chiefs who are African American, and
maybe the clerks who administer the test.
Clerks who are African, and if you were 20% or 25%, you would have leverage. Yep. People start coming for your votes.
So that's some of the
term.
Yes.
I beg your pardon?
Oh, I was just going to say that sounds like some of the way to combat voter suppression in the 1960s.
Absolutely. This was voter suppression in a brutal way. And go back to answer the rest of your question, Chris. So it started because they were very careful the way the language was crafted, never to mention race, because there were civil rights statutes following the Civil War by the Republicans who had control of the Congress. Abraham Lincoln is deceased, but the Congress, in other words, the so-called radical Republicans are the good guys in this. They're the heroes.
Yes. Thaddeus
Stevens, Charles Sumner. They're the ones who are doing the good work, and and there was a phase with the combination of Lincoln issues the executive order after Antietam that we all know is the Emancipation Proclamation. That was part of it. Part of it also was the willingness of African Americans to go into combat to fight on behalf of the Union, on behalf of freedom. And they took casualties. And that movie Glory captures it, Denzel Washington, charging Fort Wagner. Fort Wagner was in what was called the belly of the beast, and namely Charleston, South Carolina. It's right up there with coastal South Carolina was seen as being right up there with the Mississippi Delta in terms of ferocious opposition to modifying slavery. In any event, what happened is after the Reconstruction governments did have good vote, people could vote. The people who were not allowed to vote were those who had been insurrectionists, those who were leaders of the Confederacy. They had to sign loyalty oaths. Eventually, over a period of time, with primarily the use of terror, the assassinations, mass killings, and so on. Over time, the Reconstruction governments were forced out, and but you had a series of not only the 13th, 14th, 15th Amendments, you also had statutes, 1870 statutes that were civil rights laws. But the way they did it was, as it came out of that period, C. Van Woodward, The Strange Career of Jim Crow, is pretty good on this. is that in the 1890s, they began to craft legislation in the various states. They were in contact with each other, of course, using language that would give the kind of flexibility I was just describing 20 minutes ago to their county clerks, all reinforced by what I was just describing, cutting people off welfare or kicking them off their jobs. We're talking a lot of it, sharecropping and plantation work, that kind of thing, pushing people off out of those jobs, and also, of course, and law enforcement itself, finding all kinds of excuses to incarcerate people, unlawful assembly, disturbing the peace, looking me in the eye, or whatever the offense was. And then, and behind all that was mob violence. And what probably would happen in some settings, I'm speaking figurative here, not literal, but Klan and Klan-type individuals would say to the local sheriff, whom they had helped elect in many cases, either you take care of it or we'll take care of it. And so in the case of the episode at the baseball field, I think everyone in our circle had the headings of the cars, had the impression, here's a case where these guys are going to come over and give us a very, very hard time.
Brutal suppression, like you mentioned. I do have a related question, Rick, not to sidetrack you, but after the Civil War, the African Americans, especially in the South, largely registered to vote. The ones that did, Republican, because that they saw them as the good guys, as you said. When did the actual change to Democrat become the norm? Was it during the Civil Rights Movement? After that? I'd be interested to hear.
My impression is there's two phases. In the election of 1934 is generally seen as a major shift. In other words, until then, the African American community was the party of Abraham Lincoln, and the Democratic Party was seen correctly by the African American community, its leadership, as a party that was heavily compromised by Jim Crow, the weight of Jim Crow in the full measure of the party, in the Congress, in the national conventions, and on the tickets. Very often Roosevelt ran with John Nance Garner of Texas, who was a segregationist, much more conservative. Al Smith ran in 28, Joseph T. Robinson from Arkansas, and so on and so forth. But as the Depression hit, and where Herbert Hoover, the president of the United States at the time, was perceived as not using the full powers of the government to help people who were destitute. Well, there are, of course, exceptions to this, but by and large, the most destitute of the destitute were African Americans. There are plenty of poor whites, too. I probably overstated that. I'll put it a little differently. African Americans would join poor whites. What they had in common was that they were very, very poor in the Great Depression, unemployed, where they might have had partial employment or low-wage employment. Now they're out of work completely. And there was a great mass of people, white and black, who were destitute. And there was a sense that Franklin Roosevelt was trying to help with the various projects, Works WPA, PWA, and then Civilian Conservation Corps, and so on and so forth. And I know that as a young man administering the National Youth Administration in Texas, Lyndon Johnson was well liked in the black community, not because he tried integration, but he saw to it that blacks got a fair shake. Same with Huey Long in Louisiana. That's what he did. And Richard Russell, who we all know as the architect of the Southern strategies, he was taken on from his right by Gene Talmadge, who later became governor of Georgia, because Russell had voted for Franklin Roosevelt's Social Security bills, which in turn would give African Americans as well as whites some income. Talmadge didn't want that. And so, but there was a perception, and I'm giving those examples as examples of how African Americans would have seen all this, and seen that even among the white politicians in the South, there was something to work with because the federal treasury was open and trying to help. And you had a little feeling of that kind of thing in COVID-19, where on a major bipartisan effort, money poured in. You know that, I know that, to help businesses because of being shut. I mean, all kinds of places were bailed out for this. Well, take that and magnify it. And Roosevelt, that was one shift. The second shift was the African American community moved probably from approximately 90 or 95 to 5 or 90 to 10% Republican to Democrat, probably 65-35. And then as the years passed, Truman was strongly for civil rights, integration of the armed services. There's a famous episode in his career as a young man where he took on the Klan. And also, he writes, it's in his memoirs. And he appeared before an NAACP convention. And then, of course, with Hubert Humphrey in the lead and Americans for Democratic Action doing a lot of the work on this, the Democratic Convention of 1948 endorsed a strong civil rights plank. And the white South walked out in the Thurman Fielding Wright campaign for president. African American communities watching this happen and rallied. I think one of the things that happened in 1948 realized that Truman and the Democrats had shaken off a good deal of the segregationist white South, which had gone off into the third party and voted Democratic. But then came back. But then Adlai Stevenson comes along and puts Sparkman of Alabama on the ticket. Stevenson Sparkman. So Adlai was a good liberal Democrat in civil liberties terms, but in civil rights, he was no champion of civil rights. Not with a ticket that had Sparkman on it and a platform that Richard Russell of Georgia could approve. And Eisenhower and Nixon did very well in the African American community. And we know the story of John F. Kennedy and the phone call in 1960 to help Attorney General Kennedy to try to help Dr. King, who was about to be sent to Reidsville State Penitentiary, where he very well could have been badly hurt or killed. And or I think it was a traffic violation of some sort. And then, but what did it was in 1964, with the 1964 Civil Rights Act, Barry Goldwater opposed the Civil Rights Act and voted on a states' rights basis, voted no on that and on the Voting Act. And then he beat Rockefeller. The key campaign was out here in California in the spring of '64, defeated Rockefeller, who was pro-civil rights strongly, and moved and Mr. Goldwater moved the Republican Party and made in great measure into a posture. It split the party with opposition to the Civil Rights Act. That moved the black community to be 90 to 10 or 95 to 10 Democratic, and the white South began to move against the Democratic Party. Much of the white South. Some moved towards Governor Wallace, who ran a third party operation in 1968, for example, and Mr. Reagan, at that point, former Governor Reagan, opened his campaign at the Neshoba County Fairgrounds in 1980, his campaign for president, and spoke favorably in terms of states' rights and never mentioned Mr. Cheney, Schwerner, and Goodman, who had been civil rights workers who had been murdered in the cause, this year after I was there, who were murdered in the cause of civil rights. That, I think, was a decisive set of moves.
So thank you for that, Rick. It puts it in historical perspective, especially for me, because I always wondered, what the landmark points were. We only have not that much time left, and we haven't got to your career in Los Angeles, but I want you to wrap up your journey in the South and what impacts it had on you.
Well, I wound up becoming involved along with Willie Peacock, and I was doing essentially what Peacock, we often called him by his last name, told me to do, and that is to help keep Mrs. Fannie Lou Hamer, Lawrence Giat, and 4 young ladies, June Johnson and Nell Ponder, and 2 others alive in Winona, where they were being beaten and brutalized. I remember calling Medgar Evers for bail money. Peacock suggested it. Him saying, "Well, I'll call you back when I get home. I have to go out now, and we can't do anything about bail money this evening anyway." And so, when he came back, he was probably thinking, "Oh, I need to call that fellow up in Greenwood on bail money for the Winona people." And about that time, I'm imagining he was thinking that, as he reached for his keys in his pocket, he was assassinated by Byron D. LeBeckwith.
Wow.
Now, Mr. D. LeBeckwith was from Greenwood, and he was reported to have said the next day, "Well, I killed so-and-so." I won't say what he said. "And now I'm going to go after that white man up in Greenwood. I'm the white man." And they put me, realized that this was somebody who wasn't just rhetoric, and also that he could shoot. And he could shoot from some distance, and knew I was there. So they put me under a blanket and got me up to Memphis and put me on a plane to the SNCC office in Atlanta. But before in the Mississippi thing, there's another feature to it that we're trying to keep them alive. They both, in retrospect, both Mrs. Hamer and Lawrence Giat both thought they were goners. They thought that I've been beaten so badly, they're not going to let people see me. I'm going to disappear in some, swamp. They'll find me, my bones 20 years from now, that kind of thing. Mm. And in Giat's case, they were moving him around. And that got us very worried because then everyone's responsible. No one's responsible. So in any event, we called Claude Sitton of the New York Times and Carl Fleming of Newsweek, who were 2 reporters and probably the only 2 that civil rights people trusted and give a fair shake, and they had some experience with them, to get them to call the jail. We also called people in Chicago, had a whole network up there calling the jail, so the jailers knew that they were being watched. Meanwhile, Mrs. Hamer and the other ladies were being brutally beaten, and so was Giat. His face was smashed in public right in front of a Baptist church when he went over to bail them out, and so on. And then I had asked if I could go with him, and he said he thought about it for a minute and said, "No, I'll take care of it." But anyway, what Peacock had me suggest that I do, and he basically scripted me, was to call the governor. The arrest of the Mrs. Hamer's party had been affected by the highway patrol. So I called, and I got through to Governor Barnett. And obviously the reason Willie Peacock wanted me to call, and I have a white voice, I explained who I was, volunteer, UCLA graduate student, and here helping, rather recently arrived here helping the civil rights effort, and the SNCC and so on, and explained that what was going on in Winona, and then at Peacock's scripting, I added, "And Governor, if we don't hear from your folks as to where Giat is and how we can get these people out safely, we will have major demonstrations here in the Delta. We know you have your hands full, Governor, in Jackson, because Medgar Evers said being assassinated, all hell broke loose in Jackson. And it wasn't necessarily nonviolent." I said, this is what Peacock told me to say, when we got every police officer, fish and game warden, and everyone else you have deputized to try to deal with things in Jackson. And I can assure you there will be major problems up here in the Delta, nonviolent marches. And he said, "Sonny, you threatened me." And I said, "Governor, I've been here a couple of weeks. I'm not in a position to threaten anyone. I'm reporting to you what I've been told to tell you." And he said, "Well, I'll look into it." And an hour or two later, before our deadline, call did come and began to make the arrangements to get them out. Andy Young came over from Birmingham, where the integration of University of Alabama had just been happening. It was right at the time of President Kennedy's speech on behalf of civil rights, his famous speech. It was right in that period. And Reverend Young came over, and though I walked through the valley of the shadow of death was on my mind, and I probably said it, and he went over and bailed them out. I wind up in Atlanta and then on to Savannah, and I wind up in jail for a month and a half with Hosea Williams and Bruce Gordon and a group of other people. That'll be a story for some other time, I think, given your time constraints.
Okay, thank you, Rick. Well, real briefly, what did they throw you in jail for?
I was incarcerated with what were called peace bonds, or sometimes called good behavior bonds, and 6 people of the residents of the city of the county of Chatham County, city of Savannah, swore out warrants that I had disturbed their peace and their peace of mind with my activities. I was one of, I think, about 50 people. I was the only Caucasian, but one of 50 people who was arrested. The arrests included Hosea Williams, who is well known as the civil rights leader there for a while, Benjamin Van Clark, and others. And I was arrested because it was alleged I was at a particular demonstration that had bothered these people. It turns out, a night demonstration, that one night I was not there. I had a bad cold, summer cold, stayed in. There were a couple of other people in our party, Joe Iyer, John Kiffner, who are white, and who were there. But I happened not to be there. I've been at other activities and marches, and also for a time they had me take an apartment in Savannah. One of the most darn fool things I ever agreed to do, because I had widely photographed by heaven knows what groups marching around, from their point of view, sticking out like a sore thumb. But anyway, they had me go into these white supremacist meetings, and these are large outdoor meetings to stand around and get whatever information I could to bring back to them. And I also, so I was undercover for a while, and I would get calls and get sent places, and I would report in. I wasn't getting much information, so eventually they brought me back into the office, and shortly thereafter I was arrested. I think my great contribution to the cause was when the law enforcement came in to get me, and I realized my job was to keep them focused on me, because it just happened that talking with me were James Bevel. He's famous for having organized Birmingham for Dr. King, and Andy Young, who was Dr. King's. We had 2 of the top 5 civil rights leaders of the United States in the room. They eased away from me. They got very interested in the floor. They kept easing away. And I was taken, the way you do. They took me by the back of my belt buckle and hustled me out of there with me asking to see the warrant for my arrest. And they picked up little old me and missed Andy Young and James Bevel, who under the same clause, they probably could have filed warrants for them too, but they had me on the John Doe warrant. I think they probably had a lot of John Doe warrants. And
so Rick, it does sound like you were.
I'll leave you with this thought. I remember the first night I was there, the Klan was expected to march in Savannah, and it turned out the governor banned it, but I didn't know that. And there was a light in my eyes as I woke up the next morning, and I heard a voice say, "Hey, Bubba, wake up. Hey, Bubba, wake up. I'm not in the Klan. I'm not in the Klan. Wake up, Bubba." So when I appeared to wake up, he then said, "But my brother is." It was quite a time.
Well, it seems like you worked with many of the icons in the civil rights movement and made tremendous progress, but is in a very brutal, historic time. So tell me, how do you made the transition to going back to Los Angeles and running for public office?
Well, I came back here and to graduate school, and I I hadn't realized it till years later, but my incarceration attracted a good deal of publicity. I also had recognized when I went down there, I knew this, that if I went down there, part of my assignment was to draw fire. In other words, to be there. My father was education program director for the Space Administration. We're talking NASA, and we're talking NASA in the days where a lot of people were talking about NASA, get to the moon in 10 years, that sort of thing. And sure enough, there was a good deal of attention given, but I hadn't realized how much. And then I came back and jumped into my life as a teaching assistant and also personal life and so on. But shortly afterwards, the fair housing fight had blossomed because the California Real Estate Association had put a ballot initiative forward and collected signatures, which they succeeded in doing, to overturn the Rumford Fair Housing Act that had passed about the time I was in Mississippi, by the way. There had been sit-ins up in the Capitol and so on and so forth. And Jess Unruh, who was a great friend of the civil rights effort, had used his influence. The Kennedy administration had used its influence and others to get the fair housing bill passed. And it had passed with mainly Democratic votes and some Republican votes. And the CREA decided, to its eternal discredit, to reverse it. And so we decided, there was a discussion. I met with a number of people to engage in major voter registration to maximize the vote of those who would oppose Proposition 14, no on 14, and with the main target being the African American community. And so I became involved in that, along with Russ Ellis, who was head of campus racial equality, Bob Singleton, who'd been a freedom rider in Mississippi, and Steve McNichols was helpful, Paul Albert was, and a whole circle of our friends, Jim Berland, with whom I roomed later, Ellen, whom I'd mentioned earlier, and others. And we had quite a group. And in those days, the campus regulations would make it difficult to meet on the campus. So we went across the street to the YWCA. Ms. Elizabeth Blakeslee, God bless her, she was so welcoming, and we had Monday night meetings at the Y, and then where we did two things. We planned for big mobilizations on Saturday to go register voters. Those days, it was professional registrar. You had to be certified to register people. Bird dogs, so we recalled, could point to the house, and the registrar could go to the house. In other words, you would pre-screen people to see if they wanted to be registered, to save the registrar time. And the registrars, the official registrars, would come and register people. And we had and then the other thing we did is we supported the civil rights movement. But this is now Freedom Summer, 1964. And Joe Maishlish, of blessed memory, his parents owned a radio station that was similar to KPFK or KPFA, in Pacifica. It was a liberal radio station. We literally had a radio show supporting civil rights. And then we got the idea from Paul Albert of writing letters to Gus Hawkins and Phil Burton and urging them and to go to Mississippi and have ad hoc hearings about voting rights, which they did. Burton and Gus Hawkins, Phil Burton, and Bill Fitzryan from Manhattan, East Side, West Side Manhattan, went down and had the hearings and got attention and publicity and had all that drama at the time on voting rights. And so we were basically carrying on those two functions. They're very successful organizations. And then that led to the battle on the free speech movement, which the free speech movement, after all, at Berkeley, was about civil rights. Jack Weinberg, who'd been arrested, was raising money for Congress of Racial Equality. And that's why they arrested him. We weren't allowed to do it under those campus regulations. And Mario Savio and others had been in Mississippi. This is down the autumn of 64. We had a companion effort here with an effort to get a Me Too clause. And we had a sit-in in front of on the west side of the Murphy Hall, the administration building, in the drizzling rain. Big Valley Forge. There we were, a couple of hundred of us. The question is, would we go inside or not? And our negotiators were inside, negotiating basically for a Me Too with Berkeley, and which we eventually got. And we sat there. I remember looking over about 4 or 5 people over, and someone I had slightly acquainted with. There was Howard Berman sitting there with us, and there's a kind of special. I've never talked to Howard about this, but I looked at him that day and was watching him interact with some people who were giving him a hard time for being there. Some law students should have known better, by the way. And I was watching how Howard dealt with them, and I think it was at that point I fell in love with Howard Berman.
Oh, fantastic! He's
And then from there, some of us were involved in next year in James Jones's campaign, who African Americans running for the school board, and that cohort. And one last thing I should say is that I was in a phase in my own mind when I came back to be thinking more in terms of what we call direct action and political activities on that side of things. I was asked to come on the CLR board, and I was keeping them at arm's length. And the person who persuaded me to become involved in all this kind of activity on the campus, in L.A., it was Phil Burton, who they seated me next to him. He was primed for this, I think, and he suggested I do join this group. And they had a Northern California CLR underway as well. And Phil Burton meant a lot to me because I'd admired him from a distance, because here's someone who is a very strong liberal, progressive these days, we might say. I generally agreed with him on things, and he was effective. He could actually get things done. He could actually, you have to start by winning elections, and then being effective in what he would do. And he had already been demonstrating that, and he had some courage and had some guts. It stood up against the Un-American Activities Committee when it came to San Francisco, and so he was the right person to speak to me about getting involved in this whole process. As you raised the question 3 or 4 minutes ago, getting involved in the politics out here.
So then you got elected to the Los Angeles Community College Board?
Yes, a vacancy developed. What happened is we got involved, and Senator Howard Berman recruited me to. Actually, this came back to Burton, because Phil had come. Now Howard told me this for coffee a year or two ago. Phil and Burton had come to Howard. They were very close at that time to get the Young Democrats involved in Robert F. Kennedy's campaign. Howard was for McCarthy. Howard went to thought of me. I was Howard's resolution chair. Howard had been elected state president of the Young Democrats. Henry Waxman, which this is 67. Henry Waxman is a close friend. In 68, got elected to the Assembly. I was active and Howard recruited me for Robert F. Kennedy's campaign. And that's where I met my lovely wife first wife of blessed memory, Buff Singer. I've twice been very, very lucky man in marriage, to marry 2 such wonderful and committed ladies, Rebecca Rona Tuttle now, and Muff Singer earlier. And we went through that campaign, and then Howard gets elected to the Assembly, becomes majority leader. Some years later, position opens up at the Community College Board for a selection. Ira Reiner had moved on to city controller of LA, and I, with encouragement of some friends, applied for that position. And with Michael Berman's help and Howard's help and Muff and Saul Ryder of blessed memory, who was part of that CLR group and a dear friend, and Tom Bradley's help, I was able to get appointed, and then later, some years later, ran for and got elected, again with the help of the people I mentioned, Burt Margold, in addition, and Terry Friedman, and elected to the position of controller. And and sort of the driving force and quarterback of these electoral successes, the remarkable Michael Berman.
Yep. So I want to thank you for being on Captain's Table, Rick Tuttle, and you have led a very impactful life being a leader and working with other leaders to get important things accomplished. I hear you are still active today on issues and causes that you are concerned with. And I just want to appreciate you taking the time to be with us today and sharing your stories.
Well, thank you, sir. Thank you, Chris, and also give my best to Tom, Kaptain, and I hope this has been of some interest to you and to others who might listen. And thank you.
Thank you. And this has been Captain's Table, and we will be back and be with you at future dates. Thank you.